Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's involvement in improving the state of global institutions and making the world a better place. Viewers, in this special episode that we are broadcasting from the venue of the 18th G20 summit in New Delhi, we are taking up the issue of the G20 as a whole, all things G20, the relevance of the G20, the contemporary challenges that the G20 as an institution faces, and the future of this institution, whether it is going to be able to solve the global problems and live up to people's expectations. All eyes are on India's G20, and we want to be taking you through this journey. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to two very special guests who are joining us here at the G20 venue, esteemed scholars and thinkers who are from the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor John Curtin, who's a noted expert on multilateral institutions, and with him, Ms. Madeline Koch. Professor Curtin is the director of the G20 Research Group at the University of Toronto, and Madeline Koch is the executive director of the same institution. Madeline and John, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here.
Great to be with you.
Let me begin with Professor John Curtin. John, so many summits have happened. India is hosting the 18th summit, and many more are to come. The question on the minds of average people in India around the world is, does the G20 do what it's supposed to do? Does it deliver on people's expectations? What is the relevance of the G20? What is the importance of the G20? This, needs some deeper understanding. So I'd request you to begin with why we needed the G20, how it came about, and is it really living up to the expectations?
Well, every international institution is created to undertake a distinctive mission that no other international institution does. And when the G7 was created at the level of finance ministers and central bankers in 1999, it told the world what its mission was. One was to promote financial stability, because the Asian turned global financial crisis had just ravaged developing countries and infected the rich ones. But the second was to make globalization work for the benefit of all, not just the 1% at the top, but at the 1% at the bottom. And that's why the club was created, with an equal number of countries from the relatively rich north, including Japan and Australia, Korea, but the emerging and developing countries from the global south. So you had a real balance, and everybody suffered when there was global financial crises.
Yeah.
That was a public good, but it was the developing countries that most emphasized from the start that second mission of making globalization work for the benefit of all. So when we come forward to the 18th summit, when Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi of India, the host from the start, has said, this summit, my summit, has got to work for the global south.
Yeah.
Development is job number one. He's fulfilling a mission there at the start, but it's still a work in progress,
Still a work in progress.
as everyone knows.
Still a work in progress, viewers. That's what Professor John Curtin says about the G20. Let me now bring in Madeline Koch as well. Madeline, every G20 summit, there are commitments made by member countries on a whole range of issues. And I want to highlight for the audience a background book prepared by Madeline and John's team about the Indian G20 presidency as well. And this is worth reading, viewers. But let me bring you back to the question of commitment. This book also talks about the issue. I'd like you to speak about, Madeline, what does it take for the G20 to convert or to walk the talk, because there are the communiques that come out of G20 are so long and so extensive, running into dozens of pages. And, for an average viewer, the question is, what does all of this add up to? Are the leaders just, using this podium to do some grandstanding, or do they really mean what they're saying? And who's there to enforce these commitments? Because the G20 is a loose, informal institution. It doesn't have like a legally binding character to whatever people sign on to. So how successful has the G20 been in terms of commitments and delivering on commitments?
That last point that you made about there being no binding underpinning to the G20 is a very interesting one, because the leaders agree and they have to maintain a certain level of consensus throughout all of the negotiating processes that arrive at those commitments, and the leaders then have to come home and convince their people at home that the work that they're doing is worthwhile. Most of the leaders are democratically elected leaders, so if their constituencies don't feel that they are performing well, those leaders are out of a job. So that's one of the ways that we, voters around the world, we people around the world, can hold our leaders accountable for actually doing the work of the G20. But to answer your question about the commitments, yes, our research group, the G20 research group, reads the communiques and declarations carefully and identifies the commitments. And then we monitor their leaders, the country's performance in actually fulfilling those commitments from one year to the next. And we have found that the G20 has done a fairly good job over the years of fulfilling its promises. So we know, for example, based on our database of over 400 reports of assessments, that the G20 up until last year's summit, so including the Bali summit, had an average of 71 compliance with the commitments, that 71% compliance over all those 17 summits. And that's not bad. 71% is not bad. It's not great. There's always room for improvement, but it's quite good.
But Madeline, 71% compliance sounds great. The question is, why are they doing it? I mean, is it moral persuasion? Is it image? Is it ethical considerations? Because there's no penalty, right? I mean, if you don't comply, no one's going to come after you, because in international institutions, there's no global policeman to hold individual countries accountable.
Yeah.
So why are countries more or less complying with their commitments? What do you think is making them so G20 abiding?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that there is a moral suasion element, that there is an aspect to this of countries wanting to appear that they are doing the right thing, making sure that globalization does, in fact, help everyone, and that they need to fulfill their mission. They also want to maintain the credibility and legitimacy of the institution, so it's very important to them. I think that the leaders find the G20, the leaders and their countries, for the most part, find that their membership in the G20 to be very important. It is, in fact, a leading opportunity for leaders to come together and have informal discussions, because it's not legally binding. And they can actually have open conversations among themselves and move issues forward. And those kinds of opportunities for one-to-one relationships with leaders actually allow progress to be made, in addition to all of the work of the Sherpas.
Yeah. Specifically, 20 human beings sitting around a table looking at each other in the eyes, face to face, agreeing to a consensus communique with commitments, lots of them, over 400 some year. Yeah. But they all know that within a year, they're going to be back around the same table largely, and they'll have to look each other in the face. And they will know, if you promised last year and you didn't do it, you betrayed me, so I'm not going to implement the commitments that you want and that I agreed to. So they're all in this together. So that is peer pressure at the highest level.
Peer pressure and credibility is at stake. That's what you
That's
said,
right.
right?
Yeah.
In interpersonal relationships, especially at the heads of state,
Yeah.
you need to be able to hold your head up and say, look, I did my bit, and that's, I think, the commitments. When you live up to the commitments, it's supposed to mean a lot. So I think that's good news, because I want to take up, John, on the broader question now. If the commitments are fairly good, then we should be relatively optimistic that this institution, the G20, is and will remain the premier global body for governance, do you think? Or do you think there are some structural or fundamental weaknesses that could undermine it going forward? I mean, every summit host like India has faced challenges, disagreement, disunity, infighting among members and different factions and all that. But end of the day, like you're saying, it looks like the leaders are seized sufficiently of the gravity of the crisis that we are facing. So given that more and more crises, some people are calling it the era of polycrisis, where so many are all coming together, and G20 is supposed to be the premier crisis fighting mechanism. To that extent, you're optimistic about the G20 being, the only option we have really, which is both representative and also somewhat effective to be able to meet these, cascading challenges?
Yes, because you're quite right. The demand for global governance is overwhelming. All these leaders of all countries, they're in the same lifeboat on planet Earth, and they know they're about to sink. Climate change is overwhelmingly the first one that will send them down. So what global institution would you go to solve the climate emergency of today, the biodiversity crisis, the environmental crisis, and all of the others? The United Nations, which, of course, the citizens of many countries love, Canada, India, so many more. But if you look at the Charter of the United Nations, when it was done in 1945 and revised since, it doesn't even mention the existence of the natural environment, let alone its value. But the G20 does. The G20 is the only institution which together has the power to get the job done. 80% or more of the global economy, but 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So if they shove them down, the planet can survive. 75% of the world trade, and most G20 countries really depend on international trade and secure supply chains. And over half of the world's population, thanks to led by India. Now, so that's where the power lies. The contenders, the informal institutions of restricted membership that meet regularly at the leaders level, well, the G7 is just too small to get the job done and doesn't fully reflect the perspectives of the global south. And the BRICS, well, it's too small. It used to be the club of the big emerging economies, but so many of them, led by its founders, Russia and China, they're not emerging anymore. In fact, Russia is going the other way. South Africa, yeah. So the G20 is the only game in town.
G20 is the only game in town, and despite all its flaws, viewers, Professor John Curtin is saying we need this institution to exist and to flourish, because otherwise, if it's not successful, then we are all going down along with the G20. Very important point. Let me bring in Madeline as well.
Add a point to John's, which is that the membership of the G20 includes the countries that are very key players in other international institutions. So when the G20 leaders sit around the table and say, we need to make something happen, they can also then go and try to extend that work into those other institutions. So the group includes, the key stakeholders who are on the executive boards of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Of course, it includes the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council and many other international organizations beyond. So it has this radiating effect, which can also.
And Madeline, talking of the radiating effect, India has proposed to bring in the African Union as a permanent member, and we hope that will come through, and that should be something very significant.
Yes.
Which will probably bring in the voice of the global South in a more formal way. Because right now, South Africa is a full member. Nigeria has been invited to the Indian G20 summit, but otherwise there's not much representation from Africa. And there's also a talk about more regional organizations potentially in the future, following the European Union, following the African Union, also being able to come into the fold of the G20. Expansion is, on the anvil. So do you think, it sounds good from a representation point of view to have more and more people, as part of inclusive multilateralism. But the converse side is the consensus, the issue of whether you can get consensus if you keep on expanding it. So there's always the question, the trade-off between size and effectiveness.
Absolutely.
And John and your team who authored this background book, you have been tracking so many G20 summits, and getting to yes for 19 countries and the European Union itself has not been an easy task. What do you think? Are we finding the right balance? Are we in the Goldilocks kind of principle position where we are expanding but in a measured way which will continue to keep the institution effective? Or could it become a big talking shop, like, I don't know, UN General Assembly, which, with 30 or something like that,
Yes, yeah.
where there are resolutions but which then have very little teeth and effectiveness, and which are more moral and symbolic only.
Well, inviting the African Union to become a full member is a very interesting development because, in fact, the African Union has been present at the summits, I think almost every summit.
As an invitee.
As an invitee, but a kind of permanent invitee. So it's very socialized, well socialized to the G20 environment. And it's also interesting because it is, in fact, a way of going back to the origins of the G20. So in 1999, when the G20, when Paul Martin and the Canadian finance minister and Larry Summers, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, sat down and came up with the idea of who to invite to have this small group of countries that needed to come together to respond to the Asian financial crisis that was turning global. They wanted to have more than one African voice present. And the other African voice they looked to was Nigeria because it was yes, exactly, the size of its economy. But it was having internal domestic issues that made it not suitable for participating at that time. So bringing the African Union all along has been a way for the G20 to include more voices from Africa at the table. There are often other African leaders who have been invited. As you said, Nigeria this year. I don't think it's the first time that the Nigerian president has been at the summit. And so having the African Union there is a particularly good development, I think. However, unlike the European Union, the African Union is a regional association of countries. Yes, whereas the European Union is an unusual supranational organization that has its own. That's right, and it has its own policies that affect all of its members in a way that the AU does not. So, and I don't know of any other real regional organizations that have that kind of role. So I could see organizations like ASEAN wanting to be part of the G20, but I can't see that development happening anytime soon. Again, the country that holds the ASEAN presidency is almost always at the summit. So it's always involved. So there's always an opportunity there for a two-way conversation between the G20 and those.
So viewers, G20 could get bigger, but the question remains about its effectiveness, and it remains to be seen given the type of entities that are coming in and which are becoming formal members in the future. John, Indian presidency, compared to the last 17 summits, how do you see, what is it that we have brought to the table? I mean, we have been saying global south is the main thing that, defines us. But in your view, as a scholar who has observed so many presidencies, what would you think are the top 2 or 3 things that India has distinctly brought to the G20 process, which are benefiting the G20 and which are, improving the chances of its delivery?
Well, when Mr. Modi assumed the chair, even before, at the end of the previous summit in Bali, Indonesia, he outlined his priority, and they were pretty good. The slogan often dismissed, shouldn't be, right? One Earth, one family, one future. One Earth, he put the natural environment first, and no other presidency have done that. And one future, the environmentalists who we're calling the Brundtland Commission know that the fundamental principle of environmentalism is do today what will not harm future generations. So he got it. And in his innovative priority, lifestyles for the environment, which every day in every way, everything we do causes climate pollution. So everything we start to do can stop it. And India has enormous credentials here. Eat plants, not meat. So a vegan, vegetarian India is a living example of that. And yes, we do require governments to act and not just individual citizens. They need the right set of incentives. But Mr. Modi also included climate action. And well before the climate emergency, we all know, arose in the summer of 2023 and will endure for the foreseeable future without decisive action now. Another real innovation with gender equality. It's been on the agenda, but never before has it been linked to development, right? Women-led development, not development for women, but women as leaders, as active agents. So how we make that really come to life. Do we have women as the executive heads of the major development institutions in the world? The World Bank. Has it ever had a president who's been a woman? When will that happen? Oh, the Secretary General of the UN. And another one of Mr. Modi's priority was reforming the multilateral development banks and the major institutions from the 1940s. So a very innovative and a very ambitious agenda. And I think for that reason, there's very high hopes.
High hopes, innovative agenda of India, says Professor John Curtin. John, would you like to conclude on the Indian presidency?
The Indian presidency, well, I think there's overwhelmingly one great challenge. What is it going to do to control the climate emergency we now face with unprecedented heat, extreme weather events in land, sea, and air all across the world for the coming years? Yeah, Mr. Modi's priorities have really positioned India and Mr. Modi to do bigger, broader things than any G20 summit has ever done before.
Right.
But I can't help but come back to India's scientific and technological leadership, right? It reached the moon. The Russians didn't. It's going to the sun. Very few other countries can do that. But for the average person who still remembers the COVID crisis that the G20 had to focus on in 2020, 2021, and of course there's a new variant emerging. Yes, we think of the great big pharma companies in, Imperial Britain, the States. But who actually gets the jabs into arms? It's India.
Mm-hmm.
My first COVID shots, yeah, it had AstraZeneca for written on the label, but it was actually produced by Covishield. So thank you, India.
Thank you,
for
Priya.
getting me.
Say our guests from the University of Toronto in Canada. Viewers, India's leadership is quite obvious, and you can see from this discussion today in our show that the G20 experts and scholars believe that India is delivering, India is leading from the front. India is innovating and coming up with solutions not only for its vast population, but for the entire G20 and the world at large. And this is the message I want to leave you with, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has a phrase of India being a Vishwa Guru, as in teacher to the world. And there are so many different facets that we are seeing at the G20 that live up to that expectation of India being a Vishwa Guru. G20 is a manifestation of India's rise, no doubt, and we will see the G20 being a provider of solutions for global problems thanks to India's leadership. Thank you, Madeline Koch, and thank you, John Curtin. Appreciate your time for being with us on Doordarshan.
It was our pleasure.
Great to be here.
That's all, viewers. Let's continue to follow the G20 during and after the summit and in years to come, because India has made a commitment that it will do its utmost for global good. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.